The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, and every soul in the territory seemed to have gathered at the white-painted church that sat like a beacon on the hill. Horses and buggies lined the dirt road for near a quarter-mile, their owners dressed in their Sunday finest, whispering among themselves about what folks were calling the wedding of the century. Inside the modest church, Clara Whitfield stood before the cracked mirror in the small back room, her reflection showing a young woman of 22 with auburn hair pinned high beneath a veil of imported French lace. The wedding dress, ordered all the way from San Francisco at a cost that could have fed half the town for a month, hung perfectly on her slender frame, yet the silk and pearls felt heavy as chains, and her green eyes held no trace of the joy that should have sparkled there on her wedding day. "Clara, darling, you look absolutely radiant." Her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, fussed with the train of the dress, her voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction reserved for when everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. "Richard will be beside himself when he sees you walking down that aisle." Clara's stomach twisted at the mention of her intended. Richard Hale was a good man, she supposed, in the way that men of business were considered good. He owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, had never been known to drink to excess or frequent the saloons, and attended church every Sunday without fail. He was also 41 years old to her 22, with thinning hair, soft hands that had never known real work, and a way of looking at her like she was another prize bull he was adding to his collection. "Mother," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think—" "None of that now," Eleanor cut her off sharply, recognizing the tone. They'd had this conversation before, many times in the weeks leading up to this day. "You know as well as I do that this marriage is what's best for everyone. Your father's bank needs the security that Richard's land and cattle can provide, and Richard needs a proper wife to help him establish himself in political circles. It's a perfectly sensible arrangement." Sensible. The word tasted like ash in Clara's mouth. Nothing about standing here in this suffocating dress, preparing to promise her life to a man she felt nothing for, seemed sensible to her. But she'd been raised to be an obedient daughter, to understand that personal desires came second to family duty and social standing. Through the small window, she could see the men gathering outside the church, smoking and talking in low voices. Her father, Jeremiah Whitfield, stood among them, his banker's suit pressed to perfection, his gray beard neatly trimmed. He was discussing something with great animation, probably the business opportunities this union would create. Clara had heard him and Richard talking late into the night on several occasions, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the family home as they planned cattle drives and land acquisitions and political campaigns. "The music's starting," Eleanor announced, smoothing down her own dress of deep blue silk. "Are you ready, my dear?" Clara nodded, though ready was the furthest thing from what she felt. As her mother left to take her place in the front pew, Clara found herself alone for perhaps the last time in her life. After today, she would be Mrs. Richard Hale, mistress of the Broken H Ranch, and every moment of her days would be planned and purposeful and proper. She closed her eyes and, despite herself, let her mind wander back 7 years to a different spring morning, when she was 15 and the world had seemed full of endless possibilities. Luke Carson had been 19 then, the son of a drifter who'd worked odd jobs around town. He had sandy hair that never seemed to lay flat and eyes the color of storm clouds. And when he smiled at her across the church pews during Sunday service, Clara's heart had performed acrobatics that she was certain the entire congregation could hear. Luke had been different from the other young men in town, where they talked of practical things like crops and cattle prices. Luke spoke of places beyond the horizon, of mountains that touched the sky and rivers that ran wild and free. He'd given her a pressed wildflower once, a tiny purple bloom he'd found growing in a crack in the rock face up in the hills, and told her it reminded him of her, beautiful and determined, thriving despite the odds. They'd met in secret for months, stealing moments after church services and during town festivals, sharing dreams and shy kisses behind the schoolhouse. Clara had believed, with all the certainty of first love, that they would find a way to be together. But her father had discovered their attachment, and Luke had disappeared from town overnight, leaving behind only rumors and a broken heart that Clara had learned to hide beneath layers of proper behavior. The sound of the organ beginning the wedding march jolted her back to the present. Through the thin walls, she could hear the congregation rising to their feet, the rustling of fabric and clearing of throats that accompanied such occasions. In just moments, she would walk down that aisle to where Richard waited and seal her fate forever. Clara picked up her bouquet, white roses and baby's breath, chosen by her mother for their symbolic meaning of new beginnings, and stepped toward the door. Her father would be waiting in the vestibule to escort her down the aisle, to give her away like a piece of property transferred from one owner to another. But as she reached for the door handle, her hand froze. Somewhere deep in her chest, a voice was screaming that this was wrong, that she was walking toward a life that would slowly suffocate everything wild and true inside her. The pressed wildflower Luke had given her all those years ago was still tucked away in her jewelry box at home, dried and fragile, but somehow holding more meaning than all the expensive silk and pearls that adorned her now. The music swelled, and Clara knew that beyond that door, 200 people were waiting to witness her surrender. Richard stood at the altar in his finest suit, probably checking his pocket watch and mentally calculating the cost of keeping so many people waiting. Her father would be growing impatient, and her mother would be smiling that tight smile she wore when she was determined that everything would proceed exactly as planned. Clara Whitfield took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door to meet her destiny, even as every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run in the opposite direction. The wedding march filled the small church as Clara stepped into the vestibule, her father waiting with his arm extended and a satisfied smile creasing his weathered face. Jeremiah Whitfield had built his bank from nothing, and this marriage represented the crowning achievement of years of careful planning and strategic thinking. "You look beautiful, my dear," he whispered as she took his arm, though his eyes held more pride in a business deal well executed than paternal affection. "Richard is a fortunate man indeed." Clara managed a weak smile and allowed herself to be led toward the sanctuary doors. Through the glass panels, she could see the packed pews, every face in Cedar Ridge turned expectantly toward the back of the church. At the altar, Richard stood ramrod straight in his black suit, his hands clasped behind his back in the military posture he'd never quite abandoned from his brief stint as a territorial officer. The doors swung open, and Clara stepped into what felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The congregation rose as one, their faces a blur of polite smiles and curious stares. Mrs. Henderson from the general store dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while the town's unmarried girls watched with a mixture of envy and resignation, knowing that Clara's marriage to the wealthiest rancher in the territory set the bar impossibly high for their own prospects. Each step down the aisle felt like walking through thick mud. Clara's breathing grew shallow beneath the tight corset, and the weight of the elaborate dress seemed to increase with every forward movement. Richard's eyes never left her face, and she could read the satisfaction there, the look of a man claiming something he'd long desired and finally obtained. They were halfway down the aisle when the sound reached them, distant at first, like thunder rolling across the plains, then growing closer and more distinct. Hoofbeats, fast and hard, coming straight for the church. Reverend Morrison, who had been standing ready with his worn Bible, paused mid-breath. A murmur rippled through the congregation as heads turned toward the windows. The hoofbeats grew louder, more urgent, accompanied now by the sound of a horse being ridden at a dangerous pace. Clara felt her father's grip tighten on her arm as they stopped walking. Richard's face darkened with irritation, whatever this interruption was. It was delaying his moment of triumph. Then the church doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the sanctuary like a gunshot. The man silhouetted in the doorway sat astride a magnificent black stallion, steam rising from the horse's flanks in the cool morning air. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the rider dismounted in one fluid motion and stepped into the church, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor with each deliberate step. Clara's heart stopped, then began beating so hard she was certain everyone in the church could hear it. 7 years had changed him. His shoulders were broader, his face weathered by sun and wind, and there was a hardness in his storm-gray eyes that hadn't been there when he was 19. But she would have known Luke Carson anywhere, even if he hadn't been looking directly at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Well, I'll be damned," someone whispered from the pews, and Mrs. Henderson gasped at the profanity. Luke wore dark leather pants and a white shirt open at the collar, with a black coat that had seen better days. A gun belt hung low on his hips, and Clara could see the pearl handle of a Colt revolver gleaming in the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. This was not the earnest young man who had given her wildflowers and spoken of dreams. This was someone altogether more dangerous. "Luke Carson," Jeremiah's voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade. "You have no business here. This is a private ceremony." Luke's gaze never wavered from Clara's face. "I'd say that depends on the lady, wouldn't you? Now see here." Richard stepped forward from the altar, his own hand moving instinctively toward the small pistol he carried for protection against bandits and wild animals. "Miss Whitfield is about to become my wife. You'd best turn around and ride out of here before I have the sheriff arrest you for disturbing the peace." A cold smile played at the corners of Luke's mouth. "The sheriff? You mean old Tom Bradley? I passed him about 5 miles back, tied to a tree in his long johns. Nice man, but not much of a tracker." The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Several of the men began rising from their seats, hands moving toward their own weapons. But something in Luke's stance, relaxed yet coiled like a spring, made them hesitate. "You're wanted by the law in 3 territories, Jeremiah accused, his banker's instincts for protecting his investments taking over. "Whatever you think you're doing here." "I'm here for Clara," Luke said simply. And the way he spoke her name like a prayer, like something precious, sent shivers down her spine. "I'm here to give her a choice." "She's already made her choice," Richard snarled, striding down the aisle toward them. "She's marrying me today, in front of God and this entire community." Luke finally looked away from Clara, fixing Richard with a stare that could have frozen water in July. Did she choose, or was she told? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara felt every eye in the church turn to her, waiting for her answer. Her father's grip on her arm had become almost painful, and she could feel her mother's desperate gaze burning into her from the front pew. "Clara doesn't need to answer to the likes of you," Jeremiah began, but Luke held up a hand. "Let her speak for herself." His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the church. "Clara, do you want to marry Richard Hale?" The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 200 people's expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. This was the moment she dreamed of during all those sleepless nights. Luke returning for her, offering her the choice she'd never been given. But it had been 7 years. 7 years of learning to bury her dreams, of accepting that duty came before desire, of preparing herself for a life of quiet desperation as a rancher's wife. She began, then stopped, her voice catching in her throat. "Answer him, Clara," her father commanded in a low voice. "Tell this outlaw that you're exactly where you want to be." But as Clara looked into Luke's eyes, she saw something that had been missing from her life for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. Wild, reckless, dangerous hope. Without breaking eye contact with Luke, Clara reached up and pulled the French lace veil from her head. The expensive fabric fluttered to the floor like a white bird with broken wings. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "No, I don't want to marry Richard Hale." The church erupted in chaos. Richard shouted in outrage. Her father began demanding she come to her senses, and her mother's wails of despair cut through the din like a knife. But through it all, Luke stood perfectly still, his hand extended toward her. "Then come with me," he said simply. Clara looked at that outstretched hand, scarred and calloused from years of hard living, offering her a future that was uncertain and probably dangerous, but undeniably free. Then she looked at Richard's face, purple with rage and wounded pride, and at her father's expression of cold fury that his carefully laid plans were crumbling before his eyes. The choice, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Clara hiked up her expensive silk skirt with one hand and placed the other in Luke's. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that belied the hardness she'd seen in his eyes. And for the first time in 7 years, Clara felt truly alive. "Hey, hold on tight," Luke murmured, and before anyone could react, he swept her up and carried her toward the door where his horse waited, still saddled and ready to run. "Stop them," Richard bellowed, but the congregation was too stunned to move quickly. By the time the first men reached the doors, Luke had lifted Clara onto the horse and swung up behind her. "Clara!" her mother screamed from the church steps. "Clara, come back!" But Clara didn't look back. With Luke's arms around her and the wind beginning to whip her hair free from its careful arrangement, she felt the first stirrings of something she'd thought was dead forever. Freedom. The black stallion's hooves pounded against the hard-packed earth as they raced away from Cedar Ridge, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the morning air like a shroud over Clara's former life. She sat sideways in front of Luke, her wedding dress billowing around them like a silk banner of rebellion, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was already beginning, shouts and the thunder of multiple horses being hastily saddled and spurred into action. Clara risked a glance over her shoulder and saw a group of riders emerging from the town. Richard's tall figure unmistakable even at this distance, leading what looked like half the male population of Cedar Ridge. "They're coming after us," she called over the wind, her voice barely audible above the rhythm of hoofbeats. Luke's arm tightened around her waist. "Let them come. Thunder knows these hills better than any horse in the territory." As if responding to his name, the stallion's pace seemed to increase, his powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath them as they left the flat ground behind and began climbing into the foothills. The wedding dress, designed for standing gracefully in a church, was wholly impractical for horseback riding, and Clara found herself struggling with yards of silk and petticoats that threatened to tangle in the stirrups. "This dress," she gasped, fighting with the fabric. "It's impossible." Without slowing the horse, Luke reached into his saddlebag and produced a knife. "May I?" Clara nodded, and with quick, efficient cuts. He shortened the skirt to just below her knees, the expensive silk falling away like shed skin. The freedom of movement was immediate and intoxicating, and Clara found herself able to sit properly astride the horse, her legs on either side instead of the precarious side saddle position she'd been attempting. "Better?" Luke asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice even though she couldn't see his face. "Much better," she replied, surprised by how natural it felt to be riding this way, to feel the horse's power beneath her and the wind in her hair. It was nothing like the gentle, supervised rides she'd taken as a proper young lady, always accompanied by a groom and never faster than a sedate walk. They rode hard for an hour, climbing steadily into the mountains that rose like ancient sentinels around Cedar Ridge. The terrain grew rougher, the path narrower, until they were following what seemed to be little more than a deer trail winding between massive boulders and stands of pine. Clara's muscles began to ache from the unaccustomed exercise, but she didn't complain. Every step took them further from the life that had been chosen for her, and closer to something unknown but entirely her own. When they finally stopped to rest beside a small creek that tumbled down from the peaks above, Clara's legs nearly buckled as Luke helped her down from the horse. The adrenaline that had carried her through the escape was beginning to fade, replaced by the crushing realization of what she'd just done. "Oh God," she whispered, sinking down onto a fallen log beside the water. "What have I done? What have I done?" Luke knelt beside the creek, letting Thunder drink while he splashed water on his own face and neck. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "You made a choice. I ran away from my own wedding," Clara said, her voice rising with a note of hysteria. "I humiliated my family in front of the entire town. She stopped, pressing her hands to her face. "They'll never forgive me. Never." "Would you have forgiven yourself if you'd gone through with it?" The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. Clara looked at Luke, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd appeared in the church. 7 years had changed him dramatically. The soft roundness of youth was gone from his face, replaced by sharp cheekbones and a jaw that spoke of hardship and hard decisions. There were scars she didn't remember, a thin white line along his left temple, another across the back of his right hand. His clothes were well made but worn, and the gun at his hip was clearly no decoration. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. "After you left Cedar Ridge, what happened?" Luke's hands stilled on the horse's bridle. "Your father didn't tell you. He told me you'd left town, that you'd found work elsewhere. I waited for a letter, for some word. But..." She trailed off, remembering the months of watching the mail coach arrive, hoping each time that it would bring news from him. "There was no elsewhere," Luke said, his voice bitter. "Your father made sure of that. He sent word ahead to every town within 200 miles, telling them I was a troublemaker and a thief. No one would hire me. No one would even let me stay the night." Clara's stomach dropped. No, Papa wouldn't. He would, and he did. Luke turned to face her fully, and she could see the old pain in his eyes. "He wanted to make sure I understood that there was no place for someone like me in your world. And he was right." "So what did you do?" Luke was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow over the rocks. "I learned to live outside the world of decent folks. Found men who didn't care about recommendations from small-town bankers. Learned to shoot, learned to ride, learned to take what I needed to survive." The implications of his words settled over Clara like a cold blanket. "You became an outlaw. I became what your father's choices forced me to become." Before Clara could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, distant but definitely approaching. Luke was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun with practiced ease. How many? Clara whispered. Luke listened intently. 4, maybe 5, and they're pushing their horses hard. He began tightening Thunder's saddle cinch. We need to move. Can we outrun them? In these hills? Maybe. But they know this country too, and their horses are fresh while Thunder's been carrying double. Luke paused, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Clara, I need you to understand something. If they catch us, your father and Richard are going to paint this as a kidnapping. They'll say I forced you to come with me. But that's not true. It doesn't matter what's true, it matters what they can make people believe. He helped her back onto the horse, his movements urgent but careful. If we're caught, you need to decide right now what story you're going to tell. Clara settled herself in the saddle, her shortened skirt making the process much easier than before. There's only one story to tell, the truth. The truth is a luxury that men like your father can't afford to acknowledge. If you admit you came willingly, you've made them all look like fools. They'll never let that stand. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of their pursuers grew noticeably closer. Luke swung up behind Clara and urged Thunder forward, deeper into the maze of canyons and ridges that stretched endlessly toward the western peaks. They rode in silence for a while, the horse picking his way carefully along a narrow ledge that offered a stomach-churning view of the valley floor hundreds of feet below. Clara found herself pressed back against Luke's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the controlled tension in his muscles as he guided them through the treacherous terrain. Luke, she said finally, why did you come back? I heard about the wedding. Word travels fast in certain circles. That's not what I meant. He was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then, as they rounded a bend that brought them into a small meadow carpeted with wildflowers, he spoke, because 7 years ago, I was too young and too proud to fight for what mattered most to me. I told myself that walking away was the noble thing to do, that I was protecting you from my reputation and the trouble that followed me. His arm tightened around her waist. But I never stopped thinking about you, Clara. Never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay and fight. And now I'm older. And I've learned that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to lose everything for it. The sound of pursuit had faded. Either their followers had lost the trail or taken a different route. But Luke didn't slow their pace. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, Clara found herself noticing details she'd missed in her earlier panic. The way Luke's hands were gentle but sure on the reins. The care he took to guide Thunder around obstacles that might have caused the horse to stumble. The way he seemed to know exactly where they were going, even though the landscape looked like an endless maze of rock and forest. Where are we heading? She asked. Somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look. And then what? Luke didn't answer immediately, and Clara realized that perhaps he didn't know either. Perhaps, like her, he was making this up as he went along, following his heart rather than any carefully laid plan. Then we figure out what comes next, he said finally. Together. The word sent a thrill through Clara that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. For the first time in her life, she was heading toward an uncertain future, and she'd never felt more alive. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Luke guided Thunder through a narrow gap between two towering rock formations that seemed to Clara like the gateway to another world. What lay beyond took her breath away. A hidden canyon, perhaps half a mile wide, carpeted with grass so green it seemed to glow in the afternoon light. A stream meandered through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far wall in a silver ribbon that caught and scattered the sunlight into tiny rainbows. "How did you find this place?" Clara whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell of this secret paradise. Pure chance," Luke replied, dismounting and helping her down from Thunder's back. "I was running from a posse about 3 years ago, bleeding from a bullet graze and half dead from thirst. Thunder found the entrance when I was barely conscious in the saddle." Clara looked around in wonder. The canyon was completely enclosed except for the narrow entrance they'd come through, its walls rising sheer on all sides like the ramparts of a natural fortress. Sheltered from the wind and open to the southern sun, it felt at least 10 degrees warmer than the mountain air outside, and the grass beneath her feet was soft as a carpet. "It's beautiful," she said and meant it. After the chaos and fear of their escape, the peace of this place seemed almost otherworldly. Luke led Thunder to the stream to drink, then began unsaddling him with the efficient movements of a man who'd made camp in wild places more times than he could count. Clara stood uncertainly beside the water, suddenly aware that night was coming, and she had no idea what that meant for their situation. In her old life, such considerations had been handled by servants and social conventions. Out here, she was entirely dependent on Luke's knowledge and experience. "Can I help?" she asked, feeling useless in her torn wedding dress and satin slippers that were already showing signs of their rough journey. Luke glanced up from where he was arranging his gear. "Can you gather firewood? Nothing too big, just dry branches and kindling. We'll want a fire tonight." Clara nodded eagerly, grateful to have something useful to do. As she began collecting fallen branches around the edges of the canyon, she found herself studying this place that Luke had chosen as their refuge. There were signs that others had been here before, a ring of stones that had obviously been used for campfires, and what looked like the remains of a small lean-to shelter against one wall. But everything suggested that visitors were rare and the canyon's location remained largely unknown. "Luke," she called as she returned with an armload of wood, "do you come here often?" "When I need to disappear for a while." He was building a fire pit with practiced efficiency, his hands sure and steady. "It's good hunting, fresh water, and anyone tracking you would need wings to get in here without being seen." The casual way he spoke of being tracked sent a chill through Clara despite the canyon's warmth. In her sheltered life, she'd never had to consider such things as pursuit and hiding and what it meant to live outside the protection of law and society. As if reading her thoughts, Luke looked up from the fire he was building. Having second thoughts, Clara settled herself on a flat rock near the fire pit, tucking her shortened skirts around her legs. "Not about leaving," she said carefully, "but I'm beginning to understand how little I know about this, about your life, about what I've gotten myself into." Luke struck a match and touched it to the kindling, his face briefly illuminated by the small flame. "What would you like to know?" "Everything." The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "I've spent 7 years wondering what happened to you, creating stories in my mind about where you went and what you did. I think I have a right to know the truth." The fire caught and began to spread through the dry wood, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Luke sat back on his heels, studying her face in the flickering light. "The truth isn't always comfortable, Clara. I'm sitting in a hidden canyon wearing half a wedding dress, having run away from my own wedding with a man the law considers a criminal. I think I'm past worrying about comfort, despite everything." Luke smiled at that, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since he'd appeared in the church. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of the boy she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Fair enough." He settled himself across the fire from her, the flames creating a barrier of warmth and light between them and the gathering darkness. "After I left Cedar Ridge, I tried to find honest work, Spent 3 months riding from town to town, looking for someone who'd hire me despite your father's recommendations. Got turned away from ranches, mines, even the railroad crews. Clara winced. She'd known her father was ruthless in business, but the thoroughness of his campaign against Luke shocked her. Finally ended up in a town called Deadwater, about 200 miles south of here. Rough place, mostly miners and gamblers and men running from something. Met a fellow named Jake Morrison who offered me a job. What kind of job? Luke poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. Jake called himself a businessman, but his business was taking things from people who had more than they needed and giving them to people who needed them more. You became a thief. I became a lot of things. Luke's voice was matter-of-fact, without shame but also without pride. Thief, sometimes. Guard for wagon trains carrying gold. Scout for men who needed to move through dangerous territory without being seen. Whatever paid enough to keep me alive and moving. Clara tried to reconcile this image with the gentle young man who'd given her wildflowers and spoken of building a small ranch where they could raise horses and children. Did you ever hurt anyone? Luke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames. I tried not to. But this country doesn't give you many choices when survival is at stake. From his saddlebags, he produced a small leather pouch and what looked like jerked meat wrapped in cloth. Are you hungry? Clara realized that she was, ravenously so. She'd been too nervous to eat breakfast before the wedding, and the day's adventures had left her hollow with hunger. Luke handed her a piece of the dried meat and poured water from his canteen into a small tin cup. It's not what you're used to, he said apologetically. It's perfect, Clara replied, and meant it. The meat was salty and tough, but it was the first food she'd ever eaten that she'd truly needed rather than simply expected. As they ate in companionable silence, Clara found herself studying Luke's face in the firelight. The hardness she'd noticed earlier was still there, but underneath it she could see traces of the man she'd loved. When he smiled, when he was gentle with his horse, when he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, in those moments, he was still her Luke. Your turn, he said suddenly. My turn for what? To tell me about your 7 years. What was it like, living the life your father planned for you? Clara considered the question, trying to find words for experiences that had felt like slowly drowning. Empty, she said finally. Everything was planned. Everything was proper. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. I learned to paint watercolors and play the piano and make polite conversation about nothing. I attended church socials and charity events and dinner parties where the women talked about their husbands and children and the men talked about business and politics. And Richard? Clara's stomach tightened at the name. Richard was patient. He courted me for 2 years, very properly with my father's full approval. He never did anything inappropriate, never tried to kiss me or hold my hand without permission. He spoke to me about the ranch he wanted to build, the political career he was planning, the children he expected us to have. But he never asked me what I wanted, never seemed to consider that I might have thoughts or dreams of my own. Clara poked at the fire with her own stick, watching the flames dance higher. It was like being courted by a very polite stranger who'd already decided exactly what our life together would look like. Luke reached into his saddlebag again and pulled out something wrapped in soft leather. He hesitated for a moment, then handed it across the fire to her. I kept this, he said simply. Clara unwrapped the leather with trembling fingers, and her breath caught. It was a small pencil sketch of her own face, drawn on a piece of bark with remarkable skill and detail. She remembered the day he'd made it. They'd been sitting by the old oak tree behind the schoolhouse, and she'd been laughing at something he'd said about the pompous way the preacher cleared his throat before every sermon. "You drew this 7 years ago," she whispered. "I drew it the day before your father ran me out of town. I wanted something to remember you by." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You carried this all these years, through everything you've been through?" It reminded me that somewhere in the world, there was something pure and good and worth fighting for. Luke's voice was rough with emotion. "It reminded me why I needed to survive." Carefully, Clara rewrapped the sketch and handed it back to him, but he shook his head. "I keep it. I don't need it anymore." "Why not?" Luke's eyes met hers across the fire, and in them she saw something that made her heart race. "Because now I have the real thing." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and promise, and all the words they hadn't yet found the courage to speak. Clara felt as though she stood at the edge of a cliff, knowing that her next step would either carry her to safety or send her tumbling into the unknown. But as she looked at Luke, really looked at him, seeing both the boy she'd loved and the man he'd become, she realized that the choice had already been made. Perhaps it had been made 7 years ago, or perhaps it had been made the moment she'd taken his hand in the church. Either way, she was no longer afraid of falling. "Luke," she said softly, "what happens now?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I never thought past getting you away from that wedding. I suppose I figured we'd have time to work out the rest." "And do we have time, I mean?" Luke glanced toward the narrow entrance to the canyon, his expression growing serious. "Some. But they'll keep looking, and eventually someone will find this place. We can't stay here forever." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. "Then we'd better make the most of the time we have." Clara woke to the sound of voices, low, careful whispers that seemed to float on the morning air like smoke. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, her mind still caught between dream and waking. Then she felt the hard ground beneath her back, saw the canyon walls rising around them like ancient guardians, and everything came rushing back. Luke was already awake, his hand resting on his gun as he peered toward the canyon entrance. He held up a finger to his lips when he saw her stirring, then motioned for her to stay low. The voices grew clearer as their owners approached. Clara could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, their words carrying easily in the still morning air. "Told you this was a fool's errand. Joseph, ain't nobody been through here in months." "Maybe so, but we check every canyon, every cave, every rabbit hole if we have to. Mr. Whitfield's offering $500 for his daughter's safe return, and another $500 for the man who took her." Clara's blood chilled. $1,000 was more money than most men in the territory would see in 5 years. Luke's expression darkened as he processed the same information. "That's assuming she was taken." A third voice added, "Seems to me she went willingly enough. Saw her myself, pulling off that veil and taking his hand like she'd been waiting for him all her life." "Don't matter how it looked," Joseph replied sharply. "What matters is what Mr. Whitfield says happened, and he says his daughter was kidnapped by a known criminal. That's the story, and that's what we're getting paid to believe." The voices began to fade as the searchers moved away from the canyon entrance, but their words lingered like a dark cloud over the peaceful morning. Clara sat up slowly, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the early sun. "They're not going to give up, are they?" she said quietly. Luke shook his head. "Not with that kind of money at stake. Your father's making sure every man in 3 territories will be looking for us." Before Clara could respond, a new sound reached them, the soft whistle of a bird call that seemed somehow different from the natural sounds of the canyon. Luke's head snapped toward the entrance, his body tensing like a coiled spring. The whistle came again, followed by a different call, Then silence. "Stay here," Luke murmured, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Don't move, don't make a sound." "What is it?" Clara whispered, but Luke was already moving toward the canyon entrance, his hand on his gun. For several agonizing minutes, Clara crouched beside the cold ashes of their fire, straining her ears for any sound that might tell her what was happening. Then she heard voices again, but these were different. Quieter, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. When Luke reappeared, he wasn't alone. 3 men followed him into the canyon, moving with the silent grace of those who had learned to walk softly through a world that was often hostile to their presence. Clara's breath caught as she took in their appearance. Weathered faces marked by sun and wind. Long black hair braided with feathers and beads. Clothing that spoke of a culture entirely different from her own sheltered world. "Clara," Luke said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'd like you to meet some old friends of mine. This is Joseph Running Bear, Samuel Two Hawks, and David Crow Feather." The man Luke had identified as Joseph Running Bear stepped forward. He was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and a face that spoke of both strength and wisdom. When he spoke, his English was perfect, though accented with the rhythms of his native tongue. "Miss Whitfield," he said with a slight nod, "we have been watching the men who search for you. They are many, and they are determined." "You've been watching?" Clara managed, still trying to process this unexpected development. "Luke Carson is a friend to our people," Samuel Two Hawks explained. His voice was younger, more heated than Joseph's. "When we learned that he was being hunted, we came to offer assistance." Luke gestured for everyone to sit around the fire pit. "Joseph, tell her what you told me." Joseph settled himself cross-legged on the ground with easy grace. "The men who search for you are not just bounty hunters and drifters drawn by the reward money. Your father has hired professional trackers, men who know this country as well as we do. They will find this place eventually." "How long do we have?" Luke asked. "Perhaps a day, perhaps 2, no more." Joseph's expression was grave. "But there is another way." David Crow Feather, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "There is a valley, 3 days' ride to the north. Our people have a winter camp there. The white man's law does not reach into that place." "You're offering us sanctuary," Clara said, beginning to understand. "We are offering you a choice," Joseph corrected gently. "You can come with us, live among our people, be safe from those who would force you back into a life you do not want. But you must understand, it would mean leaving your world behind entirely. There would be no going back." Clara felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. To accept this offer would mean abandoning not just her family and the life she'd known, but her entire culture, her entire identity as she understood it. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help us? You don't even know me." Samuel leaned forward, his young face earnest. "Luke has been a friend to our people when friendship was dangerous. 3 winters ago, when the soldiers came to drive us from our hunting grounds, Luke warned us in time to move our families to safety. When our children were sick and we had no medicine, Luke brought what we needed and asked for nothing in return. And beyond that," Joseph added, his voice taking on a philosophical tone, "we understand what it means to have others try to control your destiny, to force you into a life that serves their purposes rather than your own. Your people have done this to our people for many generations. We do not wish to see it happen to anyone, regardless of the color of their skin." Clara looked at Luke, seeing him through new eyes. "You never told me about any of this." Luke shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "It wasn't worth mentioning. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Joseph said firmly. You did what a good man would do. There is a difference. David spoke again, his voice urgent. We should leave soon if we are going. The longer we wait, the more dangerous the journey becomes. What about supplies? Luke asked practically. Food, blankets, proper clothing for Clara? We have what is needed, Samuel assured him. Our horses are strong and fresh. We know trails that the white searchers do not. Clara stood and walked to the edge of the stream, needing a moment to think. The water babbled peacefully over the rocks, indifferent to the momentous decision she faced. Behind her, she could hear the men speaking in low tones, planning routes and discussing logistics with the efficiency of those accustomed to making such arrangements. This morning, she had been a runaway bride hiding in a secret canyon. Now she was being offered a chance to disappear entirely, to become someone else in a world she had never imagined entering. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. But as she stood there, listening to the water and feeling the mountain air in her lungs, Clara realized that her answer had been building inside her from the moment she had taken Luke's hand in the church. She had already chosen to leave behind the safe, suffocating world of her upbringing. This was simply the next step on a journey she had already begun. She turned back to the group, her decision clear in her mind. There's something you should know, she said, addressing Joseph directly. I'm not going to be a burden to your people. I want to learn how to live in your world, how to contribute something useful. I won't just be hiding among you, I want to belong. Joseph's weathered face broke into a smile. That is the attitude of someone who might actually survive such a change. Many of your people assume that their old life has prepared them for any new one. It has not. What would I need to learn? Clara asked. Everything, Samuel said bluntly, but not unkindly. How to make clothing that will keep you warm and dry. How to find food that the earth provides freely. How to move through the wilderness without leaving a trail. How to be still when stillness is required, and how to run when running is the only option. How to see the world as it truly is, David added, rather than as your people have taught you it should be. Luke stood and moved to Clara's side. Are you certain about this? Once we go with them, there really won't be any turning back. Your father, your mother, everyone you've ever known. They'll believe you're dead or worse. Clara thought of her mother's tears, of her father's rage, of the life of quiet desperation that awaited her if she returned. Then she thought of the freedom she had tasted in the past day, the feeling of making her own choices and facing the consequences of her own decisions. Maybe it's time they mourned the person they thought I was, she said quietly. Maybe it's time I became the person I actually am. Joseph nodded approvingly. Then we leave within the hour. Gather what you can carry easily. Leave everything else. Where we are going, you will not need the possessions of your old life. As the men began preparing for departure, Clara looked around the canyon one last time. This place had been a sanctuary, a brief respite between the life she was leaving and the life she was choosing. In a few hours, it would be empty again. Holding only the memory of a night when a banker's daughter and an outlaw had rediscovered each other and begun planning a future that neither of them could have imagined. But as frightening as that future was, Clara found that she was no longer afraid. She was ready to become whoever she needed to be, to learn whatever she needed to learn, to leave behind the safety of the known for the infinite possibilities of the unknown. She was ready to be free. The storm struck them just as the sun reached its peak, rolling in from the western mountains with the sudden fury that characterized weather in the high country. What had begun as wispy clouds gathering on the horizon transformed within an hour into a wall of black thunderheads that swallowed the sky and turned day into premature twilight. Clara had never experienced anything like it. The wind came first, howling through the rocky passes with a voice like a living thing, followed by rain that fell not in drops but in sheets, driven horizontal by gusts that threatened to tear her from the saddle. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks that lit the landscape in stark, terrifying detail before plunging them back into near darkness. Joseph Running Bear, who had been leading their small group along what Clara had thought was an invisible trail, raised his hand and shouted something that was lost in the wind. Luke, riding beside Clara on Thunder, leaned close to her ear. "We need shelter," he called over the storm's roar. "There's an old cabin ahead." Through the driving rain, Clara could barely make out the dark shape of a structure nestled against a steep cliff face. It looked abandoned, its roof sagging and one wall partially collapsed, but it promised protection from the fury of the storm. They rode hard toward the shelter, their horses fighting against the wind with every step. Clara's clothes were soaked through within minutes, the cold mountain rain cutting through the practical dress that Luke had found for her in his saddlebags, a simple brown wool garment that had belonged to someone from his past, someone he hadn't spoken about. The cabin, when they reached it, proved to be in worse condition than it had appeared from a distance. The roof was mostly intact, but gaps between the logs let in streams of water, and the floor was littered with debris from years of abandonment. Still, it was shelter, and they gratefully led their horses into what had once been the main room. Samuel Two Hawks began examining the structure while David Crow Feather tended to the animals. Joseph approached Luke with an expression that Clara was beginning to recognize as trouble. "This is not good," Joseph said quietly, though his voice still carried to Clara in the confined space. "I know this place. It was a way station for supply trains heading to the mining camps." "Was?" Luke asked, already understanding the implication. "The mining companies still use it. Those supplies stacked in the corner, they're fresh. Someone has been here recently, and they'll be back." Clara looked where Joseph was pointing and saw what she had missed in their hasty entry. Neat stacks of flour sacks, coffee tins, and other provisions that bore no signs of weather damage or age. Someone had indeed been using this place as a storage depot. "How recently?" Luke asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Before Joseph could answer, David called out from where he was examining the horses. "Joseph, you need to see this." They gathered around David, who was pointing to fresh horse droppings near what had once been a stable area. 3 horses, maybe 4. They were here this morning, before the storm. Samuel, who had been checking the perimeter, returned with more unwelcome news. Boot prints in the mud outside, heading east toward Cedar Ridge. Whoever was here left in a hurry. Luke's jaw tightened. "They saw us coming and rode for help." "It gets worse," Joseph said grimly. "If this is a regular supply depot, they'll have scheduled deliveries people will be expecting to meet here, as if summoned by their worst fears." The sound of horses splashing through the storm reached them, multiple riders approaching fast despite the treacherous conditions. Luke immediately began checking his weapons while the 3 native men took positions at the windows and gaps in the walls. "Clara, get behind those supply crates," Luke ordered, his voice taking on the hard edge she was beginning to associate with danger. Through a gap in the logs, Clara could see riders emerging from the storm like phantoms, 6 men on horseback, their faces grim with purpose, even through the rain and poor visibility. She recognized the lead rider's tall frame and expensive horse. "It's Richard," she whispered, her stomach dropping. "Richard and his men." Luke cursed under his breath. "How did they get ahead of us?" "They know this country," Joseph replied grimly. "And they know where someone running north would need to take shelter." The riders had stopped just outside rifle range, apparently discussing strategy. Clara could see Richard gesturing animatedly, his voice occasionally rising above the storm. With him was a man she didn't recognize, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who made his living tracking things that didn't want to be found. Professional tracker, Samuel observed, following her gaze. See how he's reading the ground even in this rain? He's the one who led them here. Can we get out without fighting? Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. Luke shook his head. They've got us pinned. The only way out is through them or past them, and either way means a fight. Miss Whitfield, Richard's voice cut through the storm, magnified by cupped hands. Miss Whitfield, I know you're in there. I've come to take you home. Clara felt a surge of anger at his presumptuous tone. Even now, even after everything that had happened, he still spoke as if she were property to be reclaimed rather than a person with her own will. I'm going to talk to him, she said, starting to rise from behind the crates. No. Luke's hand closed on her arm, firm but gentle. That's exactly what he wants. Once you're outside, they'll try to separate us. He's right, Joseph agreed. Your former fiancé did not come here to negotiate. Look at his men, they're carrying rifles, not ropes. They mean to end this here. Through the storm, Richard's voice came again. Carson, I know you're listening. You've got 1 minute to send Clara out, or we're coming in after both of you. And if I don't, Luke called back, his voice carrying clearly in the brief lull between thunder crashes, then you'll hang from the nearest tree, and Clara will come home to explain to her family how you forced her into this madness. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. He means to kill you either way. That was always the plan, Luke replied grimly. Your father can't afford to let me live to tell my side of the story. The men outside were spreading out now, taking positions that would allow them to surround the cabin. The tracker had dismounted and was moving closer on foot, using the storm as cover. Clara could see the methodical way he advanced, rifle ready, eyes scanning every possible exit. 30 seconds, Carson, Richard shouted. Joseph and his companions were speaking rapidly in their own language, and Clara caught enough of their tone to understand they were discussing fighting tactics. These were not men who would surrender easily, but they were outnumbered 2 to 1 and trapped in a defensive position. Then Samuel said something that made Joseph's eyes light up with possibility. What is it? Luke asked. Samuel remembers something about this place, Joseph explained quickly. There used to be a mine shaft behind the cabin, an old silver prospect that was abandoned when the vein played out, if it's still open. It could be our way out, Luke finished, or our tomb if it's collapsed. Be better than certain death here, David pointed out pragmatically. The sound of boots splashing through mud announced that their time for discussion was up. The tracker had reached the cabin wall and was trying to peer through the gaps between logs. Luke took careful aim and fired, his bullet chipping wood inches from the man's head and sending him diving for cover. That's your answer, hail, Luke called out. Come and take her if you can. The response was immediate. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions around the cabin, bullets splintering wood and ricocheting off stones. Clara pressed herself flat against the floor as splinters rained down around her, the sound deafening in the confined space. The mine shaft, Joseph shouted over the gunfire. It's behind the back wall. We'll have to break through. Samuel and David were already attacking the rear wall with anything they could find. Axes from the abandoned supplies, heavy rocks, even the butts of their rifles. The logs were old and weathered, and they began to give way under the assault. Outside, Richard's voice rose above the gunfire. You're only making this harder on yourself, Carson. Surrender now and I'll make sure you get a fair trial. Luke's laugh was bitter as he reloaded his rifle. Fair trial from a judge your father-in-law owns? I'll take my chances here. A section of the back wall finally gave way, revealing a dark opening that disappeared into the hillside. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth. "It's open!" David called triumphantly. "Clara, go!" Luke ordered, but she hesitated. "What about you?" "We'll hold them here as long as we can, then follow. But you need to get into that tunnel now." Another volley of gunfire made the decision for her. Clara scrambled toward the opening, her heart pounding as she stared into the absolute darkness beyond. Behind her, she could hear Richard shouting orders, the crash of boots against the front door, and the steady crack of rifle fire. Joseph appeared beside her, pressing something into her hand, a small torch made from pine pitch and cloth. "Follow the tunnel," he said urgently. "It leads to another opening about half a mile north. Wait for us there." "What if you don't come?" Clara asked, voicing her greatest fear. Joseph's weathered face softened slightly. "Then you keep running, and you remember that you chose freedom. That choice has to mean something, no matter what happens to the rest of us." The front door of the cabin finally gave way with a splintering crash, and Clara heard Richard's voice, closer now and filled with triumphant rage. "Where is she? Where is Clara?" Without another word, Clara ducked into the mine shaft, the torch casting flickering shadows on rough stone walls as she began what she hoped would not be her final journey toward freedom. Behind her, the gunfight reached a crescendo, and she could only pray that Luke and their unlikely allies would find a way to follow her into the darkness. The mine tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly into the heart of the mountain, Clara's flickering torch casting dancing shadows on walls that pressed in around her like the ribs of some ancient beast. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and the air grew colder with each step she took away from the cabin and the sounds of gunfire that still echoed behind her. She had been walking for what felt like hours when she finally saw it. A pale circle of gray light ahead that marked the tunnel's end. Clara emerged from the darkness into a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, their branches heavy with rain from the storm that was finally beginning to pass. The fresh air felt like a blessing after the stale atmosphere of the mine. But she was alone. Clara waited, straining her ears for any sound that might indicate Luke and the others were following. But the forest remained eerily quiet except for the steady drip of water from the trees. As minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, a terrible certainty began to settle in her chest like a cold stone. Something had gone wrong. Just as despair was threatening to overwhelm her, Clara heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped with hope until she recognized the voices, Richard's men, not her rescuers. They had found the tunnel entrance and were following her trail. Clara pressed herself behind a large boulder, her wet dress clinging to her skin and making every movement seem impossibly loud. Through the trees, she could see 3 riders approaching the clearing, their faces grim with purpose. "Trail leads right here," one of them called out, the professional tracker she'd seen earlier. "She can't be far." "Spread out," came another voice. "Mr. Hale wants her found before nightfall." Clara closed her eyes and tried to make herself as small as possible. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered her hiding place. The tracker was too good, and there was nowhere to run in the open clearing. Then she heard another sound, the soft rustle of someone moving carefully through the underbrush. Clara's breath caught as a figure emerged from the forest, moving with the silent grace she'd come to associate with Joseph and his companions. But this wasn't one of the men who had helped them escape. This was a woman, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing the simple dress of a frontier homesteader. She carried a rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it, and her eyes held the intelligence that spoke of long experience with difficult situations. The woman raised her finger to her lips in a gesture for silence, then motioned for Clara to follow her deeper into the forest. Clara hesitated for only a moment before leaving her hiding place and creeping after this unexpected ally. They moved carefully through the trees for several hundred yards before the woman finally stopped beside a small stream that burbled quietly over smooth stones. Only then did she speak, her voice low but carrying clearly in the forest quiet. "Name's Martha Kellerman," she said without preamble. "I've got a homestead about a mile north of here. Saw the commotion at the old cabin and figured someone might need help." "Mrs. Kellerman," Clara began, but the older woman held up a hand. "Just Martha, and you must be Clara Whitfield, the banker's daughter who's caused such a stir." Martha's eyes were kind but shrewd as she studied Clara's bedraggled appearance. "Question is, did you leave that wedding of your own free will? Or did Luke Carson carry you off like your father's been telling everyone?" Clara straightened her shoulders, meeting Martha's gaze directly. "I left willingly. Luke gave me a choice, and I took it." Martha nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Figured as much. I've known Luke Carson for 3 years now, ever since he helped me drive off some claim jumpers who were trying to steal my land. He's got his faults, but forcing women into things ain't one of them. You know Luke?" Hope flared in Clara's chest. Did he get away from the cabin?" Martha's expression grew somber. "I'm afraid I've got bad news on that score. Your Mr. Hale and his men have Luke and his Indian friends trussed up like Christmas turkeys. They're planning to take them back to Cedar Ridge for what they're calling a trial." Clara's knees nearly buckled. "They're alive?" "For now, but I heard enough of their talk to know that trial's going to be more show than substance. Your father's made sure the outcome's already decided." "Then I have to go back," Clara said immediately. "I have to tell them the truth, that I went willingly, that Luke didn't kidnap me." Martha's laugh was short and bitter. "Child, you think they care about the truth? Your father's told everyone that Luke Carson is a dangerous criminal who manipulated and kidnapped his innocent daughter. That story serves his purposes just fine. Your word against his isn't going to change anything." Clara felt the weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "Then what can I do? I can't just let Luke die for something he didn't do." "Well now, that depends on how much you trust me," Martha said slowly. "And how much you're willing to risk for that young man of yours." "What do you mean?" Martha reached into her coat and pulled out a small metal object that caught the fading light. Clara recognized it immediately. A key. "A handcuff key," Martha explained. "Lifted it off one of Hale's men while they were arguing about how to transport their prisoners. Drunk fool never even noticed." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "You're suggesting we try to free them?" "I'm suggesting you've got a choice to make," Martha replied. "You can run, keep heading north, start a new life somewhere nobody knows you, or you can fight for what matters to you. But you need to understand the stakes. If we try this and fail, we'll all end up swinging from the same tree." Clara thought of Luke's face in the firelight, the way he'd carried her sketch for 7 years, the gentle way he'd shortened her wedding dress so she could ride properly. She thought of Joseph Running Bear's wisdom and Samuel Two Hawk's loyalty, of David Crow Feather's quiet courage. These men had risked everything to help her find freedom, and now they were paying the price for her choices. "Tell me what you have in mind," Clara said firmly. Martha smiled, and Clara caught a glimpse of the steel that had allowed this woman to survive and thrive on the frontier. "They're camped about 2 miles south of here, planning to wait out the storm before moving. Overconfident, if you ask me. They've got guards, but not as many as they should." "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been watching them since they left the cabin. Old habits from when my late husband and I had to keep an eye out for hostile tribes and claim jumpers." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "Here's what I'm thinking. You go in first. Pretend you're surrendering. Tell them you escaped from Luke and want to come home. But that's not true. Of course it's not true, but it's what they want to hear. And it'll get you close to the prisoners without them suspecting anything. While you're distracting them with your story, I'll work my way around to where they've got Luke and the others tied up. Clara could see the plan taking shape, but it seemed impossibly dangerous. What if they don't believe me? They'll believe you because you'll be telling them exactly what they've convinced themselves is true. That you're a helpless victim who was manipulated by a dangerous criminal. Martha's eyes hardened. Men like your father and Richard Hale always believe they know what's best for everyone else. Use that against them. And then what? Even if we free Luke and the others, they'll still come after us. Martha was quiet for a moment, then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded paper. Not if they think you're dead. Clara's breath caught as she unfolded the paper and saw what appeared to be an official document from the territorial government. What is this? Death certificate, Martha said simply. My late husband was a territorial clerk before he took up farming, kept some of his old forms and official seals. I've had this prepared for 3 days now, ever since I heard about your situation. Clara read the document with growing amazement. According to the certificate, Clara Whitfield had died of exposure in the mountains while attempting to escape her captor. Her body recovered by Martha Kellerman and buried in the family plot of her homestead. This is brilliant, Clara whispered. But why? Why would you do this for someone you've never met? Martha's expression softened. Because 30 years ago, I was in almost the same situation you're in now. Different circumstances, but the same choice. Marry the man my family picked for me, or run away with the man I loved. What did you choose? I chose safety, married the banker's son, lived the life I was supposed to live. Martha's voice carried a note of old regret. Don't get me wrong. My husband turned out to be a good man, and I had a fine life. But I always wondered what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to choose love over security. Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, just don't make the same mistake I did. Martha folded the death certificate and tucked it back into her coat. Now, you ready to go save your outlaw? Clara looked toward the south, where Luke and his friends were waiting for rescue or death, depending on the courage of two women who barely knew each other. The smart thing would be to keep running, to disappear into the wilderness and start over somewhere new and safe. But as Clara had learned over the past few days, sometimes the smart thing and the right thing were not the same. I'm ready, Clara said, and meant it. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Martha handed Clara a small pistol. Do you know how to use this? Clara shook her head. I've never even held a gun before. Point it at what you want to hit and pull the trigger, Martha said pragmatically. Try not to hit anything you don't want to hit. And remember, if this goes wrong, we probably won't get a second chance. Clara tucked the pistol into her dress and took a deep breath. In a few hours, she would either be free to build a new life with the man she loved, or she would be dead. But for the first time since this adventure began, she felt truly in control of her own destiny. Whatever happened next, it would be her choice. The church bells of Cedar Ridge rang out across the valley as Clara stood at the crossroads just outside town, the morning sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. 3 days had passed since Martha Kellerman had presented the death certificate to the territorial authorities. 3 days since the official story had been recorded that Clara Whitfield had perished in the mountains while attempting to escape her kidnapper. The rescue had worked exactly as Martha had planned. Clara's apparent surrender had distracted the guards long enough for Martha to free Luke and his companions, and in the confusion that followed, they had vanished into the wilderness like smoke. By the time Richard and his men realized what had happened, their quarry was hours ahead and impossible to track in the rocky terrain. But now, as Clara stood looking down at the town where she had spent the first 22 years of her life, she faced a choice that would define everything that came after. Behind her, Luke waited with Thunder, ready to ride toward whatever future they could build together. Ahead lay Cedar Ridge, where her parents believed their daughter was dead and buried, where Richard Hale nursed his wounded pride and plotted his next political campaign, where life continued according to the same patterns that had existed for generations. "You don't have to do this," Luke said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "We could just keep riding and start over somewhere new where nobody knows either of us." Clara looked at him. This man who had risked everything to give her a choice, who had endured 7 years of hardship rather than compromise his principles or hers. The morning light revealed the changes those years had written on his face. The lines around his eyes, the scar along his temple, the weathering that spoke of a life lived without shelter or safety. "Yes, I do," she said finally. "I have to finish this properly." They had spent the past 3 days in Martha's cabin, planning this moment while Luke recovered from a bullet graze he'd taken during the fight at the mining shack. Martha had proved to be more than just an unexpected ally. She had become something Clara had never had before, a woman who understood what it meant to choose your own path regardless of what others expected. "Your father's already announced plans for a memorial service," Martha had told them the night before. "Seems he's decided to remember you as the perfect, dutiful daughter who died tragically rather than the rebellious one who chose love over duty." "Of course he has," Clara had replied with a bitter laugh. "It's much easier to mourn a saint than to admit you drove away a living daughter." Now, as she prepared to walk back into Cedar Ridge, Clara touched the simple wedding ring on her finger, a band Luke had carved from silver ore found in the abandoned mine. Martha had performed the ceremony herself, using her authority as a widow who had often served as an unofficial minister for the scattered homesteaders in the area. "Mrs. Carson," Luke said, using her new name for the first time since the simple ceremony. "Are you ready for this?" Clara smiled, feeling the strength that came from finally knowing exactly who she was and what she wanted. "I've been ready for this my whole life. I just didn't know it until now." They walked down the main street of Cedar Ridge together, drawing stares and gasps from the townspeople who recognized them. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the bank where Jeremiah Whitfield conducted his business, a crowd had gathered. Clara's father emerged from the building, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and finally cold anger as he processed what he was seeing. Behind him came Eleanor Whitfield, her hand pressed to her heart as if the sight of her supposedly dead daughter might stop it entirely. "Clara," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my dear girl, we thought the certificate said—" "The certificate was necessary," Clara said calmly. "But I'm very much alive, Mother." Jeremiah's eyes fixed on Luke with undisguised hatred. You were supposed to be in custody. The sheriff told me." "The sheriff told you what he thought was true at the time," Clara interrupted. "But the truth has a way of coming out eventually, doesn't it, Father?" Richard Hale pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and wounded pride. "Clara, thank God you're safe. When we found evidence that you'd been killed—" He stopped, his eyes taking in her simple dress, her sun-darkened skin, the confident way she stood beside Luke. "What has he done to you?" "He gave me a choice," Clara replied simply. "The choice you and Father never offered me." "You were confused, manipulated," Richard began, but Clara held up her hand. "I was never confused. Richard, I was trapped. There's a difference." The crowd was growing larger, drawn by the spectacle of a woman who had supposedly died coming back to confront the life she'd left behind. Clara could see familiar faces, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, the banker's clerks who had worked for her father, young women she'd attended school with who were now married to appropriate men and living the lives that had been expected of them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara said, raising her voice so the entire crowd could hear, "I want you all to understand something. I was not kidnapped from my wedding. I was not forced to leave Cedar Ridge against my will. I chose to go with Luke Carson because I love him and because I refuse to be bartered away like a piece of property to serve my father's business interests." A murmur ran through the crowd, some shocked, some disapproving, but others nodding with what looked like understanding. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice pleading. "Clara, darling, you don't know what you're saying. You've been through such an ordeal." "Mother, I know exactly what I'm saying. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm saying." Clara's voice softened slightly as she looked at her mother. "I'm sorry that you've grieved for me. That was never my intention. But I'm not sorry for choosing my own path." "Your path?" Jeremiah's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Your path leads to disgrace and ruin. You're talking about throwing away everything, your family, your position in society, your future, for what? A criminal? A man who lives outside the law?" "I'm talking about throwing away a life that was never mine to begin with," Clara replied. "A life where every decision was made for me, where my value was measured only by how well I served other people's ambitions." She turned to address the crowd more directly. "How many of you have ever been told that your dreams don't matter, that your feelings are less important than what's proper or profitable? How many of you have settled for lives that slowly suffocate everything real and true inside you?" Several women in the crowd exchanged glances, and Clara could see recognition in their eyes. "Clara," Richard said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had always made her skin crawl. "You're emotional. Overwrought. Come home with me. Let me take care of you and we can forget this whole unfortunate episode." Clara laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the morning air. "Richard, I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man on earth. I'd rather live alone in the wilderness for the rest of my life than spend one day pretending to be happy in a marriage that serves everyone's interests but my own." "You ungrateful," Jeremiah began, but Clara cut him off. "Ungrateful? For what? For being raised to believe that my only value lay in making a good marriage? For being taught that my thoughts and feelings were less important than maintaining appearances? For being treated like a prize cow to be sold to the highest bidder?" "You are my daughter," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will come home, and you will conduct yourself with the dignity appropriate to your station." Clara looked at him for a long moment, this man who had shaped so much of her life through his expectations and demands. Then she shook her head. "No, Father, I won't." "Then you are no daughter of mine." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom, but Clara felt only relief. She had feared this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, she realized that his disapproval no longer had any power over her. "Good," she said simply. "Then I'm free to become whoever I choose to be." She turned to Luke, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, letting her fight her own battle. "Are you ready to go home?" "Where's home?" he asked, though his eyes were warm with pride at her courage. "Wherever we are together," Clara replied. "Wherever we can build something that belongs entirely to us." As they walked toward their horses, Clara heard her mother calling her name, the sound filled with desperation and loss. For a moment, Clara hesitated, torn between the woman who had raised her and the life she was choosing. But then she felt Luke's hand in hers, steady and sure, and she kept walking. At the edge of town, they stopped and looked back one last time. Cedar Ridge spread out below them in the morning sun, peaceful and prosperous and utterly unchanged by the drama that had just unfolded in its streets. "Any regrets?" Luke asked. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking of the mother she was leaving behind, the life of comfort and security she was abandoning, the uncertainty that lay ahead. "None," she said finally, and discovered that she meant it completely. They rode west toward the mountains, toward a future that was entirely unwritten and entirely their own. Behind them, Cedar Ridge continued its life according to patterns established long before Clara Whitfield was born. But somewhere in those streets, Clara knew there were other women who had heard her words and might, someday, find the courage to make their own impossible choices. As the town disappeared behind them and the wide country opened ahead, Clara felt something she had never experienced before: the pure, exhilarating terror and joy of absolute freedom. Whatever came next, it would be her choice, her life, her story to write. And that, she realized, was all she had ever really wanted.